All right, Kristen, can you let me know if my screen is being shared there?
Everything's there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for joining in today. I know we have a bit of a smaller crowd here, so feel free to add questions in as they come up. I can see the chat from my window here, so please welcome to insert any questions or comments or anything as we go through. But yeah, thank you for coming today for the life cycle assessment and green building writing systems discussion. So I'm Christina Michayluk. I've been with Footprint for about almost 7 years here now, and have a background in architectural technologies, and have been working with embodied carbon pretty much since the beginning there. So not the beginning of embodied carbon, but since the beginning of my career, and it's been really exciting to be able to work on it at Footprint and kind of grow with this this service and with this the science as we kind of go through everything. So really appreciate everybody being here, and hope that you're able to get some information. I realize that my camera keeps cutting on and off here, so I think I'm just going to keep it off for the majority of the chat here. You don't need to see my face for everything here, but I'll try to turn it on at some point just to see if it's working again. But yeah, I'll just kind of get started here. So with this discussion here, obviously we're going to be talking about life cycle assessment and how they relate to green building rating systems. Maybe that is how you first came across what life cycle assessment is. Maybe you're just kind of trying to get a refresher, depending on what your background is. Maybe it's the first time you've ever heard of it. So we'd really love if anyone in the chat would let me know, is this your first time learning about life cycle assessment? Are you a seasoned pro? Where you stand in terms of your expertise, but really excited to be able to talk with you about a number of items here today. First of all, we're going to do just like a brief primer on what a life cycle assessment is, what the importance is, what goes into a life cycle assessment, as well as the rating system information itself, as well as considerations for reduction. So I'm sure we're eager to get started. So let's get going here. I was thinking about speaking for until about 12:45, and then we have a lot of time for questions within there as well. But again, feel free to send in questions as you have them. And Kirsten, if a question comes through and I don't see it, please just interrupt me, and we can see if we can answer.
Will
Yeah,
do. Yeah, will do.
Excellent. So just going to do a little brief discussion on what a life cycle assessment is, and what that means for the conversation today. And again, my camera keeps turning off, so we're just going to keep it off for now. Sorry, guys. You can see my beautiful face later. So life cycle assessment, what is this? This is something that we're hearing more and more lately. Life cycle assessment is essentially this methodology to assess your environmental impact. So life cycle assessment is looking at all these different areas of what we call a product or a service, and looking at everything from the materials it's made from, how they were extracted, how they're transported, and how they're used, and how they end their life, essentially. So we're going through what we would call a cradle to grave scenario. But what's great about life cycle assessment is that it applies to so many different things. So with life cycle assessment, obviously in this context, we'll be applying it to the building and a building's life, but you can even have a life cycle assessment on an iPhone and find out what the environmental impact of that would be. And actually Apple, has that readily available on their website, which is pretty interesting. So when we're looking at a life cycle assessment, essentially this is the methodology we're using to find out what those environmental impacts are. And these environmental impacts, one of the most important ones we're hearing about lately is embodied carbon. And I'll go a little bit into more detail in a few slides here about all the different impact categories that we see. Embodied carbon is obviously one of the more important ones, and we're hearing about it a lot. And what's so important about embodied carbon, or just about the life cycle assessment in general, is that we're really able to take a look at what happens before the occupancy of the building. So typically when we're looking at buildings, we're always trying to make them more energy efficient. We're trying to, make sure that they're using as little greenhouse gases as possible in its operation. But what about the building that comes before that? What about all of the different materials that make up the building? How about the construction from the building? What happens when these products are either recycled or disposed of? So we're really looking at, the raw materials to the end of life on these, on products or services. But again, in this case, we are applying it to buildings, and that's what makes us so fun and so fascinating. to dive a little bit deeper into some terminology, and don't worry, there won't be a quiz after this. But when we look at life cycle assessment, there are a number of different life cycle stages that we would look at. So as I had mentioned before, we talk about, the products that make up a building. When we look at the A1 through A3 life cycle stage of a building, this is really where we're looking at the products. This would be, the raw material extraction that comes from a certain product. So it's like the paper that you would get, it's the, extracting that from trees. It's the transportation of that raw material to its manufacturing site, and then all of the energy that comes from the manufacturing itself. If we take that even further, we look at the transportation and the construction required for that, the emissions that come specifically from the installation of that product. And then later on, we can get into the use stage. And this has a number of different scenarios here. We look at the use, we're looking at maintenance, repair, refurbishment, and replacement. And then additionally, we look at the end of life stage. So in some areas here, they talk about demolition or deconstruction, but what about waste processing and disposal? How do these come into play when a building is complete and those materials are no longer needed anymore? So when conducting a life cycle assessment, really this is the assessment that we do, it's the tool that we use, and these are some of the different metrics that we can get from it. So as I mentioned before, embodied carbon, which is also known as global warming potential, and that's what you'll see listed here quite a bit. This is one of the main metrics that we see when it comes to life cycle assessment. Global warming potential, has to do with the greenhouse gases and its contribution to climate change. But it's really important to note that there are other impact categories as well. So I'm not going to read these word for word, obviously, but we're looking at ozone depletion, acidification, eutrophication, smog formation, as well as an additional category, which is the non-renewable depletion potential. So we're not just looking at the greenhouse gases that are contributing to climate change, but we're also looking at all these other effects that do have a large impact on the environment around us, especially where these materials are being processed and where these places, buildings are being built as well. So while we're talking about this, it's important to know that these are only some of the categories that are involved. There are a lot other categories that can be looked at as well. But for the purposes of this discussion, these are the main metrics that we typically look at based on the more popular green building rating systems. So what's the importance of all of this? Why do we care about doing a life cycle assessment? I haven't added any slides of, burning cities or things on fire or anything like that, because I feel like it's something that we've seen so much. The one thing I really want to highlight is the Paris Agreement that we have. So Canada has signed on to the Paris Agreement, and we do have this commitment to target net zero emissions by 2050. And we have other goals such as reducing our GHG emissions below 40 to 45% below the 2005 levels by 2030 as well. So what these commitments essentially mean is that we need to start looking at how we can reduce our greenhouse gas contributions and reduce our overall emissions. And this is going to take work from all the different sectors. We are in the building sector, so obviously that's where we're focusing now, but there are large contributions of materials from concrete and steel that we use in all of our buildings, or most buildings, to greenhouse gas emissions. So with the amount of buildings that we build every year, and this is increasing, as well as the fact that we are building with these materials, it's really a constant upward battle where we need to start reducing these things, because once a building is built and you have this project that goes up, you can't really do anything about the emissions that have come from these materials. They're already done. Whereas with, an operational carbon, you can go forth and try to make improvements and changes and try to reduce this as much as possible. But the building that you had originally built, all the materials that went into there, those emissions have already been spent. And at this point, if you do any type of renovations or additions to it, these are just more emissions that are coming from this. Any questions so far? I don't think so, so I'll keep going.
I didn't see any. Yeah, go ahead.
So when it comes to a life cycle assessment, what goes into here? This will vary depending on what you're looking for in terms of your project, what your personal goals are. I realize this slide is actually quite bare, and I probably shouldn't have had it this bare here, but when we talk a little bit later about the life cycle assessment for the different green building rating systems, as well as, some potential goals there, we really are almost on every one of these projects, we're looking at the permanently installed envelope and the structural elements. So we're looking at the architectural and structural integrations there. This would be everything from your footings, your foundations, your slabs on grade, your walls, your roofs, your windows. These are all items that are included. And typically for these, we would go from, like, for example, the exterior wall all the way to the interior finish, like the drywall. But for roofs, we typically just go through the envelope into the structure, and interior finishes are something that are, depending on which rating system that you are looking at, or what your personal inclusion of this is, this may not be included as well. Interiors is something where the information has been challenging to get, and at this point the manufacturers are, and the industry as well, are really increasing what is available right now. So we're starting to see more and more data about interior products, interior finishes, and even going into like very specific products. But for most LCAs, we would be looking at a permanently installed envelope and the structural details that come from that. But we would be excluding things like site development, excavation, and building services like electrical, mechanical, alarms, and elevators. Again, this is also something that, we are seeing a desire to include, mechanical equipment. Obviously, those are made from materials and products, and, having an HVAC system means that there has been products made and emissions that have been given. So the more and more we, have life cycle assessment be a regular practice, and the more and more importance we put on this, the more information that is also coming from the manufacturers, we can start including these in the future. And the systems that we have right now and the scopes that we have will vary, and these things will be included, but at this time, permanently installed envelope and structural elements. And when we're really looking at these and the inclusions, we're looking at these from drawing takeoffs or BIM models, cost estimating practices, as well as even final material quantity. So this will really depend on, when you're getting this information, when you're doing it. If you're doing a really early design model, you may be working from some, napkin drawings, and you have to kind of figure that out. Or maybe if you're at a certain stage in the design progress, you may have some Revit models that you could take information from, or some PDF drawings. And if you even look at life cycle assessment very late in the project, you may, or even right before it's completed, you may even have some, final material quantities where it's really letting you know how much is being used. I also wanted to briefly go over environmental product declarations. And again, I hope this is not too basic for most people, but here, environmental product declarations, they are very important because they are really what is fueling life cycle assessment. So how I talked about a life cycle assessment of a building, and an environmental product declaration is really just a document that's a life cycle assessment for that specific product. So there's a number of different standards that are looked at, and the different standards will show how detailed the information is. Typically, we use what is called the product category rule, so that when EPDs are being made for specific products, that we're actually able to make comparisons on a product by product level. So that way, you're not trying to say, not trying to compare, an insulation versus a concrete item, but like they are, they have similar units, they are functional units. They're made so that they can be compared. And that's what's really important about that, is looking at environmental product declarations. They're essentially like nutrition labels. So we're able to take a look at those environmental product declarations and say, this one is at a certain level, this one's at a certain level, and be able to make some informed decisions on that. So sometimes you have a product that, might be really, it might not need as much volume, but for example, maybe the emissions are a lot higher. So you're really able to make those decisions there. And just in the picture here, I have just like an example of what an environmental product declaration would look like. So for this specific product here, which is like the mineral wool board, this one talks about specific scopes that are being shown. And as you can see here, they're showing the A1 through A3, which is the products. So that's the raw material extraction through manufacturing, as well as some numbers in terms of transportation. And then they have some numbers on end of life. So if you notice here, there's no information on replacement or refurbishment, and it's not included within the scope, which would be part of that product category rule. And in terms of the environmental product declarations, these can be very product specific, or these can be quite broad. So for example, this one here is a national EPD, which is for all types of mineral wool that are available, whereas there are some that might be specific to a product, which is specific to a manufacturing location, and we're able to take a look at different products and compare and contrast that way. And just before I go into the rating system, just because we'll be talking a lot about baselines, I thought it'd be a good idea just to kind of insert it here, even though it's a little bit choppy. But when we're talking about rating systems with life cycle assessment, we're essentially talking about, not just the reporting of what these different impact categories can be, but also through a baseline or through a reduction strategy. So through a reduction strategy, we need to take a look at what a baseline building is. And this has been something that has changed a lot. So I remember in the very early days of LEED, the definition for a baseline building has changed a little bit now, but for the most part, this is what it's pretty consistent throughout, where when you're taking a building and comparing it against another building, you want it to be of comparable size, function, orientation, and you want there to be a standard design for the location and the building type. So really what that means is you shouldn't be comparing a project that would be built in Calgary versus a project that would be built in Vancouver, because they really have different requirements for the different climate zones that are there. And additionally, you wouldn't want to compare a residence to what the requirements would be for a hospital, as again, they'd have different envelope requirements, as just different needs as well, and even programming, which may change, different heights, etc. So you really want to be, thinking about this fairly. When you're comparing against it, is it actually a building that's very similar to it? Talking about comparable size, they ideally should be the same gross floor area, but then maybe the massing might change. Maybe it's a shorter, wider building versus it being a taller, longer building, etc. And on the right-hand side here, I also have the different types of baselines that we see. This language does come directly from the LEED reference guide, but I've seen it listed in other areas as well. But early design really would be an earlier part of the design in which there was a building under study, and you might have some draft plans, and you're able to make some adjustments to that building to kind of be the current building. So you're comparing that early design to the proposed design. There's also the existing building, which would be almost like a real world benchmark. So if there's examples of other projects that are available in which maybe there's like multiple residences that are being built by a developer, and they're able to just compare what they typically do to what is going to be done on this different project. Alternative design essentially would be based on what the actual design is, but reflective, I guess, more in like industry practices. So alternative design means you've made some differentiation, some innovation in what is being currently done. So maybe you would typically do like a concrete slab on a building, but then decided, no, we're going to do this metal deck instead, or you've decided to go from a concrete building to a wood building or something within that area.
I've got 2 questions if you're ready, Christina.
Yes, we can try.
Okay, it says there are several methods of calculation such as Tracy. How are these methods different from one another?
That is a great question. I realized I didn't actually put that in my slides here. So yeah, the different green building rated systems will list the different types of, I guess, inventories that are available. So Tracy is one of the ones that is, I guess, seen pretty often. There's also another one called CML. So they really just show how the different information is being displayed and what is the information that is coming from that.
Okay, so they'll tell you which one to choose.
Yeah. Okay. Or which ones are applicable to each one.
Yeah, I know I've seen some certain things by geography, like North America versus Europe, but that was my only other addition to that, maybe. And then the next one is, what are reasonable ways to evaluate the benefit of using the embodied carbon from an existing building, so like retrofitting, refurbishing, compared to the impacts of new construction?
Oh, wow, we're going crazy with that question already. I
Yeah, that's a
love
good
it.
one.
Yeah, that's a great one. That very much supersedes everything I'm going to be talking about here. I think I have a brief slide on that at the very end. So that's a great question. When you're the city of Vancouver had put out, so the city of Vancouver is one of the, I guess, leaders in Canada, in which they're really ahead of the curve in terms of what they're doing for embodied carbon and life cycle assessment as a practice throughout like their bylaw, their building code items. So they put out a draft bylaw or they have a guideline that's coming out that's going to really discuss how different things can be compared based on the different scenario. So for an example, if you're looking at an existing building, if you're just refurbishing, essentially like your structure and everything would stay the same, but there are some things that would obviously change. So I guess it would be, what would the building be like if it was being built today, brand new? So if you had to remake the structure, if you had to, repour footings and foundations and all of the slabs, what would that comparison be? And I think that the city of Vancouver, I believe they have the draft guidelines on their website somewhere, which is fantastic because it's really great information, I think, for a lot of people who are entering the life cycle assessment world and embodied carbon world, to be able to like what we compare it to, because throughout this, the baseline building has been a bit of it's been something that we've been discovering as we have kind of gone along and as these different rating systems have provided guidance. So yeah, like taking a look at what the building would have been if it had to be repoured and was an equivalent functional design. Based off of current code items would be an interesting way to do that. And there are case studies for this that are out there. So I believe the carbonleadershipforum.org website has that listed, has a case study for that as well.
Thank you. We've gotten another question about LCA being conducted in the Asia Pacific region. I think I am not, unfortunately, as familiar with that. I'm sure we could reach out to our counterparts, but yeah, I apologize. I don't know any other specifics for that region. Do you have anything, Christina?
Well, I think that there are potentially different centers. Again, I haven't worked on any projects in India or the Asia Pacific, but I believe there are other standards or rating systems that may be applicable to that area. So I apologize that I don't have the information on that, but I would highly recommend you to go to the Carbon Leadership Forum website to see what resources might be available for you there. But there's a lot of international things as we're all developing. Europe has obviously been really ahead of the game for this information, so I'm sure that there's something in that area as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I'll throw that in the chat so everyone can have that website. And then finally, one more question. Lots of great questions. Thank you so much. How do you translate the LCA categories A, B, C, D into scopes 1, 2, and 3 categories that the governments and cities are considering? Are those changing depending on the type of assets, i.e. a strata sold building versus property you retain ownership of and operation of?
And who's that question come from?
Sorry, that's Vincent. Sorry, I should say
Vincent. Wow, that's a great question. I have to admit that ESG is not my area of expertise, but from my understanding, from my understanding, based on some little bit of research that I had done, it's possible that scope 3 is where this would, if you were to build a brand new building and it would be considered a type of asset, from my understanding, it would go into that scope 3 category. But again, I'm not an ESG expert. So, I think it'd be really great for, if there's information. I don't know if the Carbon Leadership Forum website has any information on the ESG, but there are some other great resources out there. But I think that's a great question. I'd love to take this offline and see if we can talk a bit more about this as well, if you have an interest.
Yeah, I would agree. Any purchase you're making in your supply chain is scope 3. And then your building emissions, like your operational stuff, would likely fall into scope 1. So yeah, that's a great offline. We can, Vincent, if you're, feel free to reach out to our email or on LinkedIn.
Got some great questions already. My goodness.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
So informed. I love everything.
It's great. Yeah, very informed questions. And I will let you continue. Thank you, Christina.
Excellent. Thanks. All right, so moving on with the different baselines. So again, the different baseline might change regarding that. And as I had just discussed as well, depending on if your building is considered a retrofit building, there are other scenarios that may exist for this as well. These baselines here, I guess, would be more considered for brand new construction. But again, there are different scenarios that exist, and there's a lot of guidance that's coming out for that. So now to get into the meat of the discussion, talking about rating systems with LCA. So what I'd like to go over with this is, I'd say two of the main rating systems that we see, what I'm seeing in Footprint in terms of where we're seeing life cycle assessment be asked for, or where there's been a peak of interest in it, as well as another one that has had it in there for quite a long time, and it obviously has a lot of there's a number of projects in Canada. So I'd like to go over each of these here and go over some of the different requirements for it, as well as how it integrates into these rating systems. So I think a lot of you will be quite familiar with LEED. LEED is a very popular thing. I've been working on it since the day I've started at Footprint. LEED really, I would say, brought life cycle assessment into the mind of all consultants. I believe the LEED version 4 came out back in 2013, and it had this credit called Building Impact Life Cycle Reduction. So with that, there was a possibility of you being able to gain 3 points, and they made it 3 points because to them there's some large importance. Obviously, LEED has a bit more weight to items, and they give more points to items that they feel have a lot of importance. So this came out here in about 2013, and you could gain 3 points from being able to provide a 10% reduction in your project design by using 3 different of the impact categories. So like those ones I had mentioned earlier, where it was global warming potential, eutrophication, acidification, etc. But one of those absolutely had to be global warming potential. So they're obviously seeing that importance in that embodied carbon idea. And you had to reduce, had to make a 10% reduction, and none of these different categories could go over 5% as well. So if you had a 4th category in there and somehow managed to go at an increase in up to 5% or more, it would technically not be compliant. So when we're looking at this LEED version 4, LEED version 4 isn't necessarily the one that I see people go for a lot. For those of you that work with LEED, you may be aware that LEED version 4.1 came out a number of years ago, in which, through market changes and market questions, there was this idea of, hey, we find these quite challenging and we'd love to have their different opportunities. So LEED version 4.1 came out, and there was an opportunity to have different paths and up to more points using LEED version 4.1. So the first path we had on there was just to conduct a life cycle assessment, just report it, find out what this information was, and get used to the practice of doing this. And then for paths 2 to 3, we would like to see reductions of maybe 5% or 10%. That's maybe at some point, like there was some comments that maybe that 10% was a bit too challenging, but as this came out a number of years after the original release of LEED, that maybe have been a little bit easier, but they provided a 5 and 10% reduction. So 5% would get you 2 points, 10% would get you 3 points. And then there was also a 4th path, which is if you can reduce 20% in global warming potential and reuse or salvage materials. And I think it was 10% in the other 2 other impact categories as well. This is the same, where it's global warming potential and 2 other impact categories that you would be able to get up to 4 points for that. So looking at LEED version 4 and LEED version 4.1, they are relatively the same, especially now after all these different updates have gone by. So with LEED version 4, we talk about that same inclusion of where you want to include your complete structural and architectural envelope. There are those same exclusions where you won't be including interior partitions, and you won't be including like site excavation, building services. If there's a parkade, absolutely you would include it, but you wouldn't include any site parking, or ground level like site parking there. But really, where you're taking a look at your architectural and your structural drawings and trying to see where the different reductions are possible. So as I mentioned, they both have that global warming potential must be included, that there's no increase of 5% or more. And we're also looking at this in terms of the different scopes. So 60 years is what the lifespan is on this one. So when we're looking at this building, we're taking a look at the full 60-year lifespan. And in terms of the material replacement or refurbishment, it's going to have to take into information to account as well. So if you happen to have a product that had a 75-year lifespan, you wouldn't really get any benefit from it. But having a product with a 25-year lifespan would obviously be something that increases more and more. And as an example for this one, we're looking at stages A through C. So again, it's that stage A, which is the product stage, as well as the construction stage, and then including that use stage and the end of life stage. As you would notice on the slide that I showed, there was also a stage D, which is considered benefits. So unfortunately for the LEED rating system, the benefits is not included in it, but in the next system I will go to, it is. So the next one is a zero carbon building design standard. So originally, right now we are on version 3 of the zero carbon building design standard. But when version 2 is released in, I think it was March of 2020, there was the inclusion of embodied carbon into that conversation, in which you had to report on your embodied carbon, and then your within the rating system needed to get a quote for carbon or carbon offsets or green recs, to if the project were to go into the performance standard of this, to be able to offset those. So really in version 2 we were just looking at reporting and then potentially offsetting, but when we reached into version 3, which I believe came out in June of 2022, this really provided a lot more of a focus on that embodied carbon. And again, we're looking at embodied carbon, not necessarily all those other environmental impact categories. So just at that kilograms of CO2 equivalent, which is the specific unit that we use to measure that global warming potential embodied carbon. It feels like it has a million names sometimes. The standard for this one is it does point to what is called the National Research Council, NRC's National Guidelines for Whole Building Life Cycle Assessment. So this one here is a document that came out in the last couple of years that really tries to provide a focus on like what kind of scope should be included, and like best how you should be goal setting and a number of these items. It's a document I'd highly recommend taking a look at if you are looking at life cycle assessment, just to be able to make sure that you're following those best practices, and when it comes to goal setting and scopes, that things are being followed there. So with the zero carbon building standard, we are following some really similar things that we are with LEED, except for like looking at embodied carbon and pure focus, but we're looking at that 60-year lifespan that we had followed with LEED. And we are looking at stages A through C, so that product and construction stage, use stage, as well as the end of life stage. But then there's this stage G, which I had mentioned before, is that benefits item. So if you're looking on a life cycle assessment and the program that you're using has that information available, they do want you to report it. It doesn't come into your total number information at all, but it's just there as a report, which is fantastic. With this one, now that we're in version 3, there was actually a emissions threshold that was added as well. So this one is 500 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, or you can try to do a 10% reduction on a baseline of your building. So in terms of 500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, this is something that can definitely be achievable, but it's going to depend on the building type that you have. There are, some building types, such as, residential buildings, in which this seems to be pretty easy. There isn't a lot of work that has to go into not, going over this threshold, but there are absolutely some projects that are a lot more heavy in terms of, concrete design or steel design, things that have large open spaces, I think like museums and community centers or sports centers, that this can be a challenge to meet. And with that 500 kilograms of CO2, it's really bringing into light this idea that, you need to be mindful about what products are coming into your projects. taking a look at this and trying to make reductions in your project. And, 10% is the same type of reduction that we saw in one of the LEED credits. So it's definitely possible to take a look at these different items and be able to try to make reductions where it's possible. And, with concrete and steel being such large items, taking a look at things in early design stages is really, really important. And again, we're looking at just new materials and those permanently installed materials, excluding excavation and all those items there. I guess, actually, one thing I forgot to go over was just in terms of documentation required. So my apologies there. I had provided some little information about what kind of things that you need to provide in terms of documentation for leads. So with these, really, we're looking at just like a lead form that goes over the results of the impacts, as well as a description of what a proposed building would be like, of what a baseline building would be like, and then just a summary of the results. And it's the same that goes for lead version 4 and 4.1. Lead version 4.1's form is a little bit more intense and has a lot more information to fill out there. But going to the zero carbon standard and what's required with there. So the zero carbon standard it's obviously the life cycle assessment is just one part of the total standard. There is a number of other items that would need to go in here, but the workbook has a section for embodied carbon that needs to be completed. The IFC set drawings, or the drawing set that is being used for the submission, and specifications are something that would also be included as well. They also want your LCA software output files. So depending on what program you're using, this may not be applicable. Later we'll just briefly discuss Athena Impact Estimator and how that is a product that actually has a file, but there are online programs like One-Click LCA, in which you just may need to have a list and quantity of the materials here, so like a bill of materials. There's also a embodied carbon reporting template. And as I had also discussed as well, there is a carbon offset quote that's required, and the number that comes from your embodied carbon assessment would need to be part of that as well. I think there's some questions that maybe have come through. Would you be able to read them off for me, Kristen? Sorry, I'm having problems with the accessing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The first one, it says, can we integrate LCA in climate change policy, making it possible, or sorry, I need to reread that. Can we integrate LCA in climate change policy? And if possible, please provide some suggestions.
All right, I'm not really a policy person. That's unfortunate. I wish we had Andrea on the call right now. So with the CLF Alberta, we have somebody who's been really good in the policy world. Wish she would be on the call right now to be able to help out with this. But, life cycle assessment is something that we're seeing inserted on the municipal level, if that's maybe a part of that conversation, where we're seeing that our cities are, taking control of how their emissions are being spent, and being able to put life cycle assessment as something that is required for all new buildings, something that is required for city-owned buildings, and being able to mandate those through a policy are what is it is a great option there. And we're seeing cities like City of Toronto do it. We're seeing the City of Vancouver do it. I believe that they're starting to request this right now in the City of Calgary, and in the City of Edmonton, I think it is based off of city-owned buildings, if that's what I remember correctly, Kristen.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, so it's something that we are seeing kind of come into play with that. And then as these are kind of coming into play and we're doing them more and more, they may be, part of like the everyday requirement for this.
Great, thank you. And the next one says, is it net zero carbon building or carbon neutral building? Both are different.
So with the zero, yes, there are very different definitions. Carbon neutral building and net zero carbon building. So based on like the specific standards, they call it the zero carbon building, and then based on their specific definitions, I don't think that it's not necessarily a carbon neutral building. My focus on this is for the life cycle assessment. So in terms of the energy, there is a different type of equation that kind of comes into play for that, but they are definitely different definitions, and something that people tend to use interchangeably, but it needs to be kind of clearly defined whenever talking about rating systems or different scopes that are available.
Okay, thank you. Next from Vincent, is there any differences between what CAGBC recommends for zero carbon guidelines and what the municipalities across Canada will implement as requirements? Do you think most municipalities will build their own standards or will follow this one?
That's a great question, actually. Yeah, there again, Vincent. Wow. I guess like with city, as I mentioned before, the city of Vancouver is, looking at their own guidelines to be able to, provide specific guidance to their projects with their climate zone, etc. So it is very possible that there may be different guidelines depending on where you are. I've also seen a lot of projects that just say, hey, we should just follow the zero carbon building design standard guidelines, which then technically point to the NRC guidelines. So there is definitely an opportunity for them to be, drawing back to specific rating standards or to other city municipalities. But I think we're also looking for inspiration wherever we can for this. Again, City of Vancouver has been doing a great job of this, having a life cycle assessment as part of a rezoning application, and the Toronto is also doing this. So I think we're all kind of taking inspiration, and it will be really interesting to see where it goes. Some may take a look at others until they're ready to kind of bite their teeth into their own policy.
Thank you. Okay, and then this one's is people letting us know that yes, that LCA is already integrated into policy and federal government buildings. Absolutely, it is. This was, I think, a question for starting the policies in that new country. We're looking at different countries other than Canada at that point. So yeah, just a reminder to everyone, LCA is mandatory for all new federal government projects as of 2025 from Phoebe. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Phoebe.
And then, yeah, someone letting us know it's integrated into climate policy. Okay, thanks.
Cool.
Go ahead, Christina.
Great. So we're kind of starting all the questions at the beginning, so there'll maybe some additional time at the end here, but just wanted to quickly touch on another rating system that I have seen through Canada, which is Green Globes. So Green Globes is a new construction rating system. The most recent version is NC 2021. This obviously, when you're seeing up there, it says up to 20 points are available. That sounds fantastic, especially when you compare it to the 3 or 4 points that could be available from LEED. What's good to know about this one is that obviously the threshold and points for Green Globes is a lot higher, but it's still a significant amount of points, and really just points to why it's such an important part of this here. So this one here with Green Globes, we're kind of going back to the way LEED looks at gaining from this, is looking at different impact categories. So this one also takes a look at 3 different impact categories. One of them as well needs to be that global warming potential, and we have here that it states that it's a 5% reduction minimum. So the way that they actually look at it is that each of your categories must have a 5% reduction, each of those 3 categories. But the way that they actually total the points ends up being the total percentages of all of them. So if you had 5 plus 5 plus 6, you'd be able to get the points for that specific total. So you're able to kind of get a little bit more points based on that, instead of just saying, oh, we're all hit 5, so we've only hit that threshold. But it's important to note, just like with LEED, this one cannot exceed the reference baseline case by more than 5%, which is pretty great. So for each of these different rating systems as well, they are listing in their requirements that there are certain tools that can be used for this. I will go over them a little bit later as well, but this one does list Athena Impact Estimator and Tally, and those are the 2 that are listed pretty much throughout all these different reference cases. That those are 2 programs that are very good. There's also One Click LCA as well that could be applicable. Another one to note about this as well is that the NC 2021 asks that you take a look at least 2 different building designs when conducting this assessment. So really, you're going to be taking a look at 2 alternatives, and then making the choice of which one has the most impact of a reduction, and hopefully it gets you as many points as possible as well. And just a note for this one, Green Globes, for those that aren't very familiar with this specific rating system, this one's actually a questionnaire-based rating system. So you go through, instead of completing forms like you would with LEED or these crazy workbooks, you just kind of submit a different questionnaire, and then if there may be some backup documentation that is requested, but there ends up actually being like a site visit in which a verification happens. So there is an opportunity for a detailed report to be brought in for this, but the information is essentially there on the questionnaire for you to do. So some people have already beat me to it with the questions. I just kind of threw in here that there are policies for cities as well, and how the city of Vancouver and the city of Toronto are some that are doing this, and how they focus on the embodied carbon metric specifically, looking at that global warming potential. But really it's starting where it starts off with them asking for reporting of information. And then there's this potential transition into what our thresholds will provide us. So for example, with the Toronto Green Standard, Tier 2 now requires that some buildings meet that 350 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. So how does LCA fit into projects? So really, when we're talking about this team and timelines, how do we get this going? We want to reduce. We see the importance. We really want to try to make an impact and make reductions on our projects, not just necessarily for LCA, but for LEED and for zero carbon, but just in general, this is something that we should be doing. So really, it is best to start as soon as possible and have your goals ready. So if you know that you're going to be pursuing LEED versus zero carbon framework, it's really good to get that information confirmed right away. When looking at zero carbon framework and LEED, they have, obviously they both talk about that global warming potential, but there are other impact categories that are available within the LEED rating system as well. And depending on what changes are made, there's always a potential that one of them could result in an increase. So it's important to really know where you're standing with that and make those decisions early on, and really bringing in many people as possible you can into the team. So obviously your architect and your structural engineer should be an important part of these decisions. They should be able to work with whether the life cycle assessment person is in the architecture team, in the structural engineering team, or a separate consultant. We should all be pulling together to see where we can make changes in the building. So finding out what is typical, what is some new innovation that can be done. Can we make certain changes really early into the design phase? And if you have a contractor that can be brought on board to talk about the feasibility of those things, that's even better. I didn't want to provide like a large slide like this. So really, I'm going to say this is a clip from a really important document that is located on the Carbon Leadership Forum website called Roadmap to Reducing Building Lifecycle Impacts. It's a 2-pager that goes over when you should be looking, a good recommendation on when you should be looking at certain things. So there's a lot of detail here, and if I tried to go over everything, it would take me a really long time. So I highly recommend people would take a look at this through the Carbon Leadership Forum website. But really, it's telling you when you're looking at a whole building, when you're looking at structure and envelope, when are some really great opportunities for you to be doing certain checks. They have hotspots on here, so being able to say, hey, at this point, we need to be able to target a reduction, or this is something that we should investigate, and it just really provides a really great idea of key milestones and actions that are there. So ideally, the sooner you can confirm that this is something that is going to happen, the better. But at the same time, depending on if you're going for a rating system, which one you're going for, there may be some flexibility in that. So with LEED version 4.1, we talked about that 1 point could be available just from conducting a life cycle assessment. So while ideally we'd like to be able to get in and have opportunities for reduction, if you're a developer, or you're a client or owner that is new to life cycle assessment, and you're really curious as to what your projects are looking like, or what this building's impact would be, you can go ahead and do that at various stages of the project. And if you're going through near the end of construction, you can have some real information on those specific quantities that are involved. So there is always an opportunity to discuss life cycle assessment, but trying to do it the sooner the better so that changes can be made. It ends up being really challenging to make changes to a concrete specification if the issued for construction set has already been done. So trying to get those changes and questions in and those investigations as early as possible is always appreciated by everybody on the team.
Okay, there's actually one more question. Oh, sorry, maybe we should.
Oh no, go for
wait
it.
till the end. Okay. It says, do you have any information or experience on how ILFI requirements or LCA are similar? ILFI requirements for LCA are similar or different from LEED, zero carbon building, and green globes?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I haven't worked with ILFI to date. Would obviously love to, but I believe they have some similar, there's typically some similar scope in there from my understanding. So unfortunately, I don't know if there is a threshold cap on that.
I
Um,
do have it up. I just was
yeah, yeah.
curious also. So I saw that the ILFI zero carbon certification, so you need that 10% reduction in
Yep,
embodied carbon. And it's that similar to the zero carbon where you don't exceed the 500 kilograms.
perfect.
And then the energy pedal is a 20% reduction in embodied carbon. And any offsets have to be, of course, through an approved carbon offset provider. So, but yeah, definitely that's the upper echelon of net zero and net carbon neutral projects for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are other, other rating systems that I'd say are kind of becoming more popular. I think there was a new one that kind of came up called the Reset certification as well. That's looking at embodied carbon. I think they're in a beta stage right now as well. So I don't doubt that we'll see a lot more of these pop up and see what different innovations can happen because of them. It's pretty exciting. So I just wanted to quickly, we only have about 8 minutes left here and we've been getting questions throughout, but I wanted to try to wrap it up real quick here. So in terms of the tools that are looking at the different tools that are available for here. So there are, if you start typing in life cycle assessment, if you start typing in embodied carbon into Google, you're going to see a plethora of different tools that are available. Some that are web-based, some that are down for computer. They're going to be all over the place. So when it comes to your tools, what can be used will be very much dependent on your required references. So if you're looking at a lead project, taking a look at the specific references that are in there, they had mentioned that Athena Impact Estimator is one of the approved items for them, but obviously one-click LCA is also something that is used as well. Tally is something that is great too. So depending on, these are all projects that these are all programs that can go through those larger life cycle stages, but it's really important to note as well that there are some tools that are out there that are absolutely fantastic, but they only cover the early stages, so that A1 to A3. So just looking at the raw material extraction, the transport, and the manufacturing of an item. There are going to be the A1 through A3 is considered it's typically the largest from the pie of that. So making an impact in that area is still going to be very impactful. But based on if you're doing a lead certification, there is more information that is required through those B and C stages as well. And also thinking when taking a look at tools about the availability of local data, in terms of Canadian data, like Athena Impact Estimator has a lot of information available for Canada. One-click LCA has a number of EPDs that are available that are Canadian based, but there are also some tools that are based in the UK and use a specific reference to UK data set. There are also a number of products that are specific to the United States. So just making sure that if you're using an LCA tool that you're able to get that more local data. This can be Canadian data or even data that's closer to you as well. And there's also some really great opportunities as well for BIM integration. So there are some programs like Tally and One-Click LCA that will work directly with Revit. And for example, One-Click LCA has other features as well, like the Carbon Designer, where if you're working in the really, really early design stages, it might be able to help you kind of make have information on potential for columns and beams and different design cases like that based on that. So there are a number of tools that are available. These are the three that we typically see the most, and there's a lot of different opportunities for that, as well as Athena is a free program, whereas the other two that are listed here are paid programs. So it's really going to depend, and maybe if you're working on if you have a project that has a life cycle assessment or your own building, maybe this is something that's going to be up to that practitioner or the architect or the structural engineer. So it may not necessarily be yourself working on it too. I guess there's some more questions there as well.
There is. So the first one, a good question. What about performance metrics? Shouldn't we revisit the buildings 5, 10, 20, 50 years after construction to remeasure their performance and compare and learn from that?
So yeah, in terms of performance measures, so when it comes to the embodied carbon, when we're looking at the materials that are in there, looking at them, I guess from a early design phase versus how things were actually installed, making sure all the different materials are in there and getting all those real world information is very important. But that information in terms of 5 10 years, 20 years from now, the building, unless there has been some type of renovation to that project in terms of embodied carbon or in terms of life cycle for embodied carbon, it's going to be the same, right? There isn't going to be any change to the emissions because they have already been emitted. So unless there's a renovation that's happening, absolutely, like that is information that can be taken into account if you're, renovating some finishes or replacing drywall. That's definitely information that can be done. But learning from our buildings is always a great thing. If there's a design that's being a design that's kind of like a staple and it's being used over and over again, having a life cycle assessment to understand where it's sitting and then trying to make reductions after that is really great.
Thank you. Great answer. Next one, are there any certifications that a client should or could require from consultants that are executing LCAs on projects?
That is a great question. So there, to my knowledge, and I am pretty sure there are no certifications necessarily that say that this person is a guaranteed life cycle assessment expert, but there are things out there that I guess provide people with training. So really there's a lot of training that's involved, not just for using the products, but using the different tools, but also for how to conduct the LCA. So not to talk about one-click LCA and specifically call them out for this, but they do provide a number of different training sessions with their own program, which unfortunately is a paid program, but they do provide these like different boot camps and courses on how to conduct LCA, best practices, and even how to try to look for reductions in those different areas. So they are really helpful. So even if you're not necessarily planning on going with a one-click LCA license, I think it's a really, really handy course. There's a lot of information that's out there. You can get a certificate from it. I've seen it all on LinkedIn, and it's been a great resource. But there's a lot of information that's been available. Carbon Leadership Forum, we have different hubs all throughout the world, and all of our different hubs are really great at providing information. So I think I came across one yesterday that was CLF. I want to say it was Houston, and they actually had a discussion where they showed how to use the Athena impact estimator and how to use Tally. There was even a conversation from CLF Vancouver, or I guess CLF British Columbia now, talking about biogenic carbon. So there's a lot of amazing conversations that are out there for us to learn from, but at this time there's no like set certification. There's no like lead AP for this necessarily, but those one-click LCA certificates are very helpful if you're wanting to get one, or if you're wanting to look at something but not a specific certification standard or accreditation standard. Sorry.
Great, thank you. One more. How do you perform the hotspot identification and sensitivity analysis?
I'm sorry, what was that? My microphone had cut out.
Yeah, sorry. How do you perform the hotspot identification and sensitivity analysis? I'm not quite sure what that's pertaining to. Maybe we need to, sorry, it's an anonymous question. So sorry, if the person could maybe provide a bit more detail, that might be better. And then there is one more question that came up. Oh, thank you. Ivan has some information on that. There's a micro-credential program for whole building life cycle assessment at BCIT. I did not know that. Thank you.
So we are at 1 o'clock here, and I do have like 3 more slides to go over. So I'm just going to quickly finish these here. So in terms of just looking at reductions, so I had kind of alluded to this earlier, structure does count for the majority of the emissions. So when taking a look at the different structure types and taking a look at different types of concrete mixes and curing times, really that early analysis is really important so that you're able to talk with your structural engineer and see maybe where changes can be made. Maybe you can increase the strength on a slab to be able to decrease its thickness. Maybe the curing time, having a longer curing time will help reduce the embodied carbon. Maybe you're changing your mix design can provide more recycled content. So when looking at that, really, it's going to be early design questions to look at items like those, and being able to, let's say, for example, make different comparisons between different wall types, looking at Is wall type 1 and wall type 2, how different are they? Is one performing better? But also we need to take into consideration envelope and energy performance. There are other things that need to be considered when looking at this. Just like when looking at different roof types, there might be one roof type that's really beneficial, but maybe it doesn't have as great of a maintenance life on it. It needs to be replaced a little bit more. So really, I think that may be part of the hotspot question as well. Just taking a different look at approaches, and also like holistically, how will this product work for us long term, and how does it balance out in terms of energy performance and envelope as well. But really taking a look at it, product substitution alone may not be enough for it. You can't just necessarily replace an insulation and say that you've got that 5%. It's really about all the different areas coming together to really do those different practices. So. And just in terms of the future of LCA, really this is an evolving practice. We're seeing micro credentials coming up. We're seeing training events. We're seeing changes in standards, new guidelines that are popping up. And as these different standards come up, there's also going to be more stringent reductions. And also, like we had mentioned earlier, talking about retrofitting of existing buildings. This is something that, because you're not necessarily replacing a building structure, there's a potential for large savings on embodied carbon and in the other impact categories by not having to demolish that. So retrofitting of existing buildings is something that we're going to see more and more, and there will likely be standards on that. So inclusion of interiors and building services and systems is also something that we will see as well, as more information becomes available and we're able to look at that data, and then being able to make those informed decisions. So excellent. So that was the end there. I guess questions, we've gone over like quite a few questions already. You guys have fantastic questions, and it's been amazing being able to be part of this conversation here, and obviously have a very informed group, which is fantastic.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you. We'll have to call it. And I really appreciate everyone joining. And thank you so much for Christina for her work and the presentation, and sharing her knowledge with us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.